academic programs here, and it's a great pleasure to introduce today Stephanie Sadre-Orafai, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of Cincinnati and currently a visiting fellow here at the BGC. Stephanie's research focuses on what she calls the commercial aesthetic industries, high fashion modeling and commercial font businesses. And she approaches these through the lens of visual anthropology to see at the intersection of these two businesses the kind of cultural and institutional practices that underlie them and the meanings that they issue forth. So on promotional materials that are essentially ephemeral and so forth, she's published a number of essays already on related fields. I'll just quote a few of them: Models, Measurements, and the Problem of Mediation in the New York Fashion Industry and Visual Anthropology Review, 2016. Recasting Fashion Image Production, an ethnographic and practice-based approach to investigating bodies as media in fashion studies. And the intriguing The Figure of the Model in Reality Television in Fashion Models, Image, Text, and Industry. She's currently writing up a book manuscript, Type by Design, while you're here, and I suspect very much that this is drawn from your current material. So please welcome Professor Sadre-Orafai.
Thank you for that introduction and for everybody for coming today. I'm really excited to be here in residence at the BGC as a visiting fellow and to share this project with you today. While I am writing up this material, I am still actively collecting data. So I just want to start out with that disclaimer. This is including both interview and archival data. So there's a lot of moving pieces and ways in which this project might shift and transform that are actually really exciting for me because it's having me rethink what the end product could be. Could it also be an exhibition, a documentary short, a digital humanities project to make some of this ephemera that I'm going to show you today more accessible to researchers. So that's one caveat. The second caveat is I'm already rethinking the New Yorkness of this. Part of it was to set it here. I love New York. I am a NYU alum, and I did my original field work in the New York fashion industry, so it's something that I know very well. And while it is an international industry and there's circuits and people move around a lot and it's global, there is still something, at least in the modeling and casting side, that's very local to this place. And in terms of the number of casting directors that are working here, it's really a small handful, about 30 people. Right? Coming into the research for the typeface design portion of this, this is a project I started back in 2014. And as a good anthropologist wanting to have the humility of learning how to do something and being terrible at it, I took typeface design classes, sat in on typography classes, those who can't do research. And so that has been an ongoing conversation with the folks at the Type at Cooper program, at the Cooper Union, the Type Directors Club, Type Thursday, the Letterform Archive, all of that. So it's been this dipping in and out in summers and spring breaks and keeping up with that community. But the data that I've been collecting this year while I'm on sabbatical has been more focused on the specimens and the specimen designers. What I am discovering, though, is that unlike the modeling industry, while there are, for the same kinds of historical reasons why the New York fashion industry is concentrated here in terms of, publications and designers and all of that, which we also see in terms of the New Yorkness of the New York design, type design community and its connections to the program at Cooper and other things like that. It has really, since the advent of digital technology and really web publishing, the industry has gone transnational. So you might have somebody working on a typeface design here, but collaborating with a font engineer in another country that's publishing it out of a Swiss foundry. So that's the other thing. I'm going to be showing you some specimens that are really interesting, but they might have been produced in Massachusetts or in Zurich. But there's still, I'm trying to figure out what the boundaries of that are. The other thing that's not probably explicit, I probably don't need to tell you, but I'm just going to confess. Originally, I was thinking that this project would focus on the 1980s to the present, and I'm thinking of shrinking that window to really the last 10 to 15 years. And the reason for that is going back to the fashion industry and looking at some of this ephemera, there are it's convenient for me because I was in the field from 2003 to 2007. There's this pretty sharp delineation in 2007 and 2017 that makes this nice kind of neat 10-year period to collect this stuff, where in 2007 it was, Polaroids were being phased out. It was a full embrace of the digital in terms of image production, but still a wariness of social media. And in the type industry, there were definitely people designing digital fonts, but it was always oriented towards print production. So we see the same thing happening in the fashion industry. Now, with the advent of web fonts in the past few years, and changing attitudes in the industry, the fashion industry, a lot of these beautiful print ephemera that I'm going to show you just aren't being produced anymore, not at the scale. And so those are kind of two key moments in terms of print, like digital oriented towards print and digital oriented towards web, that I think will be interesting to explore and will make the study a little bit tighter. So this talk explores how new faces are made and marketed in two distinct New York commercial aesthetic industries, the retail font business and the high fashion modeling industry. Retail typefaces enter the market in a variety of ways. Some are client-commissioned work whose period of exclusivity lapses. Others are independent projects developed and released independent of a client brief, while others are proposed by independent contractors who may also be hired to work on script or family extensions. Models, on the other hand, are typically scouted around the world and placed in New York markets, where they undergo development or socialization to learn how to become a model. There's a large infrastructure of global scouting networks that not only find models on the street and in malls, but also increasingly digitally through Instagram feeds. That's a big place to get scouted. IMG Models, which is a pretty major industry, has an Instagram account that's called We Love Your Jeans, Genes. And there's some, kind of troubling videos about the lengths to which scouts have thought out migration patterns and genetic ancestries in their logics of where in different countries to go, particularly Brazil. So there's a lot of stuff going on with the scouting that I'm not going to get into today, but I'm happy to talk about later. And they also do this through feeder agencies. So these scouts will go out to smaller agencies in non-major fashion markets, find models to bring back. And then in these main markets like New York, they'll front the startup costs for these models, right? So they'll pay for their travel, for their clothes, for a place to live, for food, portfolios, these composite cards, right? But they're all charged against their future earnings, right? And so this is one of the challenges that I'm coming up against in terms of how to collect this material, because technically it is the model's property. And it's also the case that an agency would not keep these cards, which are produced every few months. A new card is produced, and then these big packages twice a year, because the only thing that's valuable to them from a business standpoint is the latest one. And so that makes these two sites a little bit different. And so while both type design and modeling can be seen as what the designer John Hudson has described as secondary industries, or those driven by and in the service of communicating others' messages, my goal in this project is to refocus attention on their own independent histories and logics rather than their instrumental uses and relationships, while simultaneously drawing them into conversation with one another as parallel industries and practices. Indeed, while both typefaces and models are chosen for their formal and visible features, they're also meant to blend into and amplify clients' messages through effective forms of non-conscious resonance, many of which are culturally specific. In both industries, tensions exist between visibility and invisibility, legibility and aesthetic nuance, and the management of lay and expert visions in producing culturally recognizable types and individual faces. So in my talk today, I'm going to do a lot of the framing work to explore what these tensions might reveal by arguing first why we should look at typefaces and models together at all, and second, she gets it, why we should consider these in-industry promotional ephemera produced about them as a similar material form, because it's not necessarily obvious or apparent. At stake in my argument are questions about objectification and typification, or the processes by which we classify and group people and things that in turn shape our thoughts and perception of the world. While psychologically, typification helps us bracket and make sense of the overwhelming amount of visual information we encounter on a daily basis, it also narrows our perspective about what visual differences mean and look like. This in turn shapes our social interactions, both real and imagined, with one another. By joining together the histories and expert practices of animate and inanimate type producers, my goal is to think through what's at stake at becoming more object-like as a type for people, and conversely, what it means to have both a face and body for an inanimate form. To do this, I'm drawing on recent work in anthropology and cultural studies that have shown the recursive moral logics, shown how recursive moral logics structure patterns of cultural stereotyping and the importance of face in these interactions. As Greg Noble writes, quote, "To give a face to evil paradoxically produces it as concrete and abstract, knowable but elusive." And we can have a sense of this whenever there's a tragedy or an attack or something happens. We want to see the face of the perpetrator, or we want to see the face of the victim, right? Because we have these abstract feelings that we want to attach to it, and still in plumbing and searching that face, we might come up empty, right? So drawing on Levinas and Goffman, he argues, quote, "The suturing together of disparate events is ultimately an act of defacement. It involves reduction, displacement, and intensification. It decontextualizes social acts, yet renders them more amenable to explanation by drawing on cultural pathologies," end quote. So rather than allaying anxieties, these processes provide what Noble has called a virtuous paranoia, a good enough explanation that, however partial, shores up a sense of moral unity, reinforcing our own culturally received typifications. Indeed, it's the immediacy of face and our assumption about how bodies function as mediums that make the discussion of human types so fraught. Yet this emphasis on embodiment and faciality can also be seen in inanimate types. Type designers draw on animate parts to describe the anatomy and shape of letter forms. They're not only type faces, but letter forms have arms and legs, ears and shoulders, spines and tails, eyes and chins. They're also part of families and superfamilies, with sibling pairs of serif and sans serif typefaces. This suggests that even as typification compresses visual information in both objectifying and potentially dehumanizing ways, it's entirely dependent on the idea of both a body and a face, as well as a certain kind of relationality. As such, I'm going to argue today that reading these two kinds of ephemera together allows us to expand how we think about the process of typification and its relationship to human and non-human faciality. Before I make this argument, though, let's get a sense of what these look like. And don't worry, I've got a lot of slides, a lot of pictures. Okay, so type specimens. So to sell and market fonts, type foundries and font licensing and resale companies produce type specimens. They've taken the form of posters, pamphlets, booklets, brochures, as well as digital documents like PDFs and interactive websites. Yet they do more than just illustrate a typeface or a type family's character sets and features. They're visual arguments that use prototypical layouts and curated texts to highlight a typeface's ideal use and treatment. What Letterform Archive curator Rob Saunders has described a type designer's manifesto of intent by example. As Saunders has also noted, these ideal uses can differ depending on the national markets, signaling the importance of cultural context for how letterforms and typefaces are read and placed visually. Specimens contain mostly prototypical layouts because they're released when fonts are first published, so before they have a chance to be used. They're rarely updated or revised to include actual use cases, though type foundries will sometimes publish links to this other website called Fonts in Use, which is user submitted, or certain kinds of case studies, which they do that to show kind of proof of concept. So while they're rarely updated, they can be modified across platforms and across resellers. So that's another shift that's happened. Instead of a typeface being tightly connected to a single foundry, it might be sold across multiple outlets. They might have different imaging requirements. So there's a multiplication of what counts as a specimen now. So the most important thing about a specimen is it provides a context for the typeface. And they're usually produced now by and for graphic designers. Type designers love to talk type with each other, but they don't buy fonts from each other, right? And so they're thinking about how is this actually going to be used. And some of the type designers that I've talked to have expressed difficulty with coming up with a specimen for their own face. Others are fine doing it, but there does need to be that kind of distance. So here's an example of a type specimen from 1900 that was published by the American Type Founders Association. And so here you see an example of a use in context. This American condensed is for newspaper layouts. And so they've done mock-ups. It's like a fold-out. They've done mock-ups to show what it looks like as a headline, a deck, a body copy, right? This is another example from ATF. And this one's a little bit unusual compared to now because it has actual photographs in its mock-ups. And so this one is advertising an entire family of the modern Roman italic, modern Roman, modern bold, and bold italic, and the tango, which is more of a script. On the left is an example of one of these single JPEG images. This is Eloquent Pro, which this specimen was designed by Joe Newton for Veer. And here you can see it's showing off the typeface. You don't have a full, character set, so it can just be one image like that. On the right, this is a newsprint specimen done in tabloid, produced by Commercial Type here in New York. And what's interesting that I'm not really going to get into today, but something that's been coming up is where the source of the text comes from and how they're dealing with different languages and stuff like that. And so Wikipedia is a really common resource because of its ability to translate different texts. So the text in this specimen is a Karl Lagerfeld quote, and then they've used Google Translate to come up with the different variations. And with this kind of material production, you're seeing this more for art book fairs, conventions, if they do like a lecture or speaking tour, or just because they love print, right? These are typically free. There are some type foundries that have recognized the trend, like everybody's really, since Helvetica, the documentary, everybody loves to talk about typefaces and have an opinion about them. And so these specimens have become coveted design objects. And that's another interesting thing in terms of a secondary industry outside of, not a secondary industry, a secondary market for these specimens. Type designers are collecting the old ones, but people outside of design are collecting these as well. This one is really tiny because I wanted you to see every page of the PDF, but this is DJR Forma. This is a digital file. This is an example of the waterfall style where it's showing you the different weights, right? It has a complete character set. There is a small bio about the history of this design, which was originally a client commission. It's a revival as well. And so you can see here that if you read it, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. But you can notice that there is an attempt to use not just English in this. This is another example, too, of an algorithmically derived set of terms. And so this designer does do his own specimens, and a computer programmer has created a script for him that when he inputs the size and the weight that he wants, it will query the dictionary, and he can load any dictionary he wants, and it'll generate a list of words for him. And so then it's about him kind of playing around and seeing which ones feel right or might have an unexpected, rhythm to them. So that's something that's kind of interesting. This is another example of a digital PDF. This is from Lucas Sharp's Sharp Type. These were designed by Justin Sloan. So again, we see here this same kind of waterfall pattern, but here they're all done thematically, right? So the OG, it's all fashion terms, which talking to Justin, he said it was helpful because people's names are from different countries, so you get to use a lot of different accents. And then with the Sharp Sans display number 1, he had just gotten a puppy. And so he was really interested in dog breeds and said, it also was this opportunity to use a lot of different languages. So those are some of the examples of that. And then here, these are posters. And so these are, poster size. And this is a really interesting foundry. It's a Swiss foundry, but they do a lot of fun stuff where they'll make these websites, which if we have time after Q&A, we can look at some of this, but they'll do these interactive websites, they'll do buttons, they'll do printed books. It runs a whole gamut. And so the idea of these mini sites or site-specific specimen sites has kind of taken hold as a way to show dynamically in video and GIFs what the typeface can do, the different weights and widths. So composite cards. In a similar manner, modeling agencies use composite cards to join together published and unpublished images of models into cohesive narratives of possibility. Revised each season and for different fashion markets and market segments, comp cards are promotional leave-behinds that evolve over a model's career and, like type specimens, reflect broader shifts in both industry practices and technologies, as well as cultural differences by market. Both kinds of promotional type ephemera are media about media. They're artifacts explicitly created to encode preferred readings and ideas about type. So here are two early examples from the 1980s. I think it's 83 on the left and 85 on the right, of Zoli, which was one of the modeling agencies that was kind of hit its peak in the 70s, but was also operating in the 80s. And so these initial ones were kind of simple, black and white. Interestingly enough, they were all printed by the same person previous to this. This guy, Peter Marlowe, who runs the Models Composite, or it's modelscomposite.com, but it's the archive of the Peter Marlowe print shop. And so he came up with this idea. He was dating a model that she had to write her information on the back of these 8x10 images. And it was really tedious, and he wanted to help her. So he figured out a way to print these and took it around to different agencies in London. It got really popular. He was friends with John Casablanca, so when he moved from Paris to here to open up Elite, that became one of his clients. And Peter Marlowe went out of business like in the 90s because of this advent of desktop publishing, right? And this ability for agencies to handle the printing in-house, which is how most of the non-show cards now get printed. It's done in agency. But these are some of the examples of the early ones in the 80s. On the right is an example of one from 1990. And again, that one is not from Peter Marlowe's archive. The only reason this one exists is because this model was profiled in New York Magazine, and she had a copy of her card, right? So it got reprinted that way. The ones on the left are from Marlowe's archive, but they're from Paris, and I thought I would be closer to be able to see this. Paris and London? Copenhagen? London? Okay, sorry. And so this is like towards the end of the 80s, early 90s. So now we have color. And these are some that I want to spend some time with. So this is Hani. She's a model that is still currently modeling, and she's very successful. But I want to kind of walk through her show cards, how they've evolved, and how we can see that shift happening across agencies. So these are all images of her show cards from about 2007 to 2010 maybe, or 2009. 2010, okay. And so these are all done by one agency, Supreme. And at the time, Supreme was run by this man named Paul Rowland, who was a very significant person in the field in terms of revolutionizing what these show packages looked like.
Thank you very much.
And he received a lot of pushback. So that image where she's kind of jumping, all of the models were shot on the roof of the agency jumping, and there are hairs in their face. You can't see what they look like. They're blurry, right? It's kind of an anti-comp card. And a lot of people in the industry who aren't necessarily into the art of it were really frustrated by these cards. There was a big backlash against it. It's like, we just need to know what the girls look like. On the left, that's the earliest one. This was an actual Polaroid right at this period where Polaroids were being phased out. And so there's this aesthetic of using Polaroids in fashion photography. The next one next to her jumping, this was based on Avedon's, what was it, American West project. And so Paul rented out a studio and shot all of the models in that style. Again, there was a lot of backlash against this because they were made up to look like normal people, and sometimes a little draggy. And so there was a lot of pushback to, like, why would you want to market models in that way? The next one, it was a more diffuse concept. The one below it, he took all of the models out into the woods and did this Hare Krishna thing. The ones below that are this whole Orientalist fantasy. They were fold-out cards. That was kind of an Arabian Nights, 1001 Nights kind of thing. So this is kind of the range of some of the more out there packages that exist. This is when she moved to Ford, and it's significant to note that Roland also moved to Ford at this period. And so he was reinterpreting the brand and trying to harken back to the days when Eileen Ford was really a force in the industry. These received a lot of pushback too because they had, you know, drawn on eyebrows and this like very over the top look. He went back to Polaroids the next season, and then he left the industry. She then moved to IMG, and so you can see like how different these cards look. It's the same model, but what a difference the representation and the team working on these cards can be. Okay. So these are all from IMG. These are examples from, I believe it's Fall Winter 16. And so the top left is London Squad. The next one is Women Milan. Then it's both of the ones on the bottom are Women Paris. The one on the left is for couture. The one on the right is for ready to wear. And so what I want you to see here is that the same images of a model can be used by these networked modeling agencies, but they put different textures on it. They do different treatments with it. They crop it differently. They lighten them. So this is the same model in the same period of time within weeks. Being represented in these different ways. And even, you know, with these women ones, with agencies that are owned and affiliated by the same people. And one of the things that I found out working with some of the packaging designers and printers that design these packages is that print production was still very local, right? So they wouldn't, a print producer in New York would not work with, even though if there was a woman in New York and a woman in Paris, they wouldn't work with them because the turnaround was too tight. So that's another reason why I'm interested in looking at this 10-year period of kind of the uptick of these really elaborate show packages and their downfall. This is her most recent show card. She didn't do shows this past season. So this was for spring, summer 17, which happened in the fall. And one thing that I want you to notice here is underneath the smaller image is her Instagram. And so this has become a really important part that is now being listed on modeling agency websites along with a model's body measurements, is not only her Instagram account or Twitter account, but how many followers she has, right? And so there's this pressure to, for the models to self-produce themselves and sell that as, you know, value added to brands and clients that want to leverage that social media presence. And so that's another way that these cards are kind of becoming more fluid. And so on these cards, often that image, in other versions of it, that image will actually be an image that the model took herself. So not even, you know, of the model, but an image like that. This last one I want to show you is another kind of comp card, or what I'm considering also a comp card, because it's another kind of document that modeling agencies are producing for the models that they represent, and it's called a Polaroid or a digital sheet. Sometimes they still are able to get Polaroids, but that name sticks, right? And so in other writings where I've thought about, you know, the documentary imaging practices in the fashion industry that are so different than the kind of fantastical imagery we think about, is this sense of Polaroid's inalterability in the age of Photoshop. Even though while I was in the field, I would see people take Polaroids, digitize them, edit them, and then print them with the borders, right? And so there's this whole play still going on with that. And there were also, that's another thing that I want to pay attention to this project, the shifting ideas about what the media can do. So at the time that Polaroid was being phased out, there was this crisis about, oh, it's going to be all these doctored images, the digital photography is too harsh, and then as soon as digital was okay, it worked out for everybody, it became this discourse about like, well, anybody could take a good Polaroid. Like, it makes everybody look amazing, whereas before it was like, you've got to be really amazing to take a strong Polaroid. And we're seeing that now too with video, right? So everybody knows that these digitals are manipulated, and so because the technology is too expensive and not really there yet, a lot of times clients will ask for video castings. Right? These digital Polaroid sheets play off of an idea of casting images, which these are these kind of very stark images to your left. This is from an agency called Tomorrow is Another Day, that was originally a scouting network based in Germany, but now finds and just works as a mother agency directly with clients for runway shows. And so this kind of uniform imagery is preferred by casting agents, and the casting agents and the modeling agents are kind of always in this battle in terms of wanting to present the best version versus, the quote-unquote what they really look like, so their clients aren't surprised. So even though these might have the same kinds of cropping and formatting that you would see in a casting photograph, the ones produced by the agencies have a ton more personality, better lighting, better editing, all of that. One other thing I want to draw your attention to, so this is all within weeks of each other, and it's too small for you to see because I wanted you to be able to see these all at once. But her height changes, her shoe size changes. Some of this is human error, some of this is just known in the industry that these are not accurate measurements. So nobody really trusts these as measurements. So for people approaching these and thinking like, oh, well, this would be a great tool, like I have all the measurements, I know what the model looks like. Sometimes we see that we don't know what the model looks like, that the measurements are not true, right? And so these are working in some other way. These are doing something else. And what that is, I'm interested in finding out. So moving from fashion to fonts, like how did that happen, right? So when I give the one-sentence version of this project, people on both the type and fashion sides readily understand it as a comparison of fashion design and typeface design, clothes, letters. Or better yet, because some people aren't really cognizant of that typefaces are designed, typography, right? And so images of, like this one of Charles Pignot with a Dito specimen frame behind him that's featured in the Abbott Miller Through Thick and Thin, Fashion and Type, leap to mind, especially among the type designers who agree that yes, there's definitely a connection between fashion and type. And I think that that's because they understand a connection between a typeface design and other designed things, like clothing. There's similar trends, historical references, revivals, practices of transforming an abstract concept into a material form that they feel comfortable talking about. They will wax on about what they think makes a font look like fashion or elegance. That's informed in part by in-industry uses, but also how they understand typefaces to work. When I clarify that I'm actually interested in models and typefaces, it's a lot less obvious. So going back, my previous project was in the New York fashion industry, starting in 2003. I was originally interested in types and model trends, particularly what at that time was called ethnically ambiguous, and wanted to see how those images were produced, how those models were selected. And I wanted to do it from start to finish. I was reading a lot of media ethnography, production studies, and one of my advisors suggested that I go to a photo shoot, like it's no big deal, right? And so I ended up getting an internship in the photo department of an ethnic women's magazine, which was great. I negotiated access by interning, was able to collect data, go to photo shoots, source multicultural stock imagery for the front of the book, the whole 9 yards. And 2 months into it, just as we were closing the issue, the magazine folded, which was devastating for everybody that worked there, that had to find out about it on the radio while we were at work, but also for me, because all of this information that I had collected only seemed to me valuable insofar as I could measure it against what happened, right? So I was really seeing it as this, this is the backstage. I need to see what's on the stage in order for that to be of value. I then tried to get other internships at women's magazines. I was like, okay, the photo department's where I need to be, but was unsuccessful. And so as a stopgap measure, wanting to keep my feet in the industry, I started working in a modeling agency. And initially my idea was like, oh, well, it's good to understand how pre-production works, but I'll get to the real stuff soon enough. And I ended up staying there for 2 years and doing some work as a scout, judging some regional modeling competitions, and learning more about that. And in that process, I realized how much other stuff was happening that if I was only focusing on the end product, I would miss. And eventually, I did get into another magazine. It wasn't that interesting. I went to a photo production. It was the Beauty Closet. I got a lot of great products, but it wasn't as interesting as I thought it would be. And so for the main part of my dissertation fieldwork, I focused on casting agency and a high-end modeling agency. And I became frustrated with how the industry discourse was defining both casting agents and modeling agents as cultural intermediaries, right? This was right in between the time of the uproar over the too skinny models, right? So there were a lot of models dying of anorexia. It was, this whole thing. And then bookending that in terms of when I left the field was the black model controversy, right? Which got blamed on modeling agents are not finding them, casting agents aren't putting them in front of us, and the designers and the clients we're being protected by were artists, right? And so that was frustrating to me because what I was seeing on a day-to-day basis in the casting agency, in the modeling agency, was that they were doing some kind of work. It was also frustrating to me because the models were seen as the subject material, right? But not the creative author of these images, right? And so that led me to reframe and rethink my approach of what's actually being produced here. So rather than see casting, model development, and modeling as pre-production, I, at that time, framed it as production, right? And my argument was what they're producing is the model's body as a form of media. And because they can't step on the toes of the designer or the client, right, who are in charge of visually transforming what a model looks like and affecting that on the body of the model, they have to do it through language, right? And so it became a lot about the subjunctive, a lot about references and metaphor, right, which leave no material traces, which was interesting to me ethnographically, right? In talking to casting directors and talking to modeling agents, you would also get this idiom of, well, it's my eye, right? And so it was this embodied sense, but they were doing it through language, right? And so I recorded a lot of these casting interactions. I also recorded how agents were talking to models, right? And so what that shift meant was model development and model socialization was also part of this process. They're all working to make models legible. Models were having to learn to relate to themselves as media, right? And so what does it mean to rethink the body as mass media? It means that we're focused on process, not product, right? And so it's about capturing what few material traces there are and supplementing that. So I also came up against, which I'm sure a lot of you working in decorative arts or design things that people feel like they have a lot of opinions about and a lot of ideas about. I would talk about this, so there would be a couple of reactions at academic conferences, or when I was giving job talks, people would be like, "Oh, these people sound so stupid," right? Or the kinds of conversations, they seemed like empty signifiers, right? But they were rooted in a particular understanding that was important. The other thing was when I would talk about the malleability of race and what this use of language could do to kind of open up those spaces, even though they were severely restricted, people would want to see what the models looked like, right? There was this hunger to see the face. Like, I can tell if this person is black or not. I can tell if this person could pass or not. And so in my early work, I refused to use images. I didn't want to make it transparent. I wanted to show that this was an achievement, this was a construction. and that this language that seems, not technical or specific enough really was doing that work. So that's, I hope, giving you some sense of informing how I'm now approaching dealing with all of this material image stuff. I'm like, whoa, and I can, associate it with people and talk about names. And so this is an example of how comp cards are actually used during a casting. And so this was in that transitional period, so you see Polaroids, you see digitals actually stapled on, and these are put on boards, and they're shuffled around, and they're used to create layouts, and then they're all thrown away. So none of this stuff exists anymore, right? And so for that first book project, it's really about showing that in language, showing that in the infrastructure, showing how, even though this is happening in a way that's not recoverable or not traceable, it is ethnographically. And so that's where the model part comes from. So it started with fashion. Then to get to the fonts, I actually started teaching with a fine artist at the University of Cincinnati and discovered I was terrible at leading a studio. I had a lot of thoughts, but not a lot of ways to get students on board. And so as an ethnographer, I went and participated in an experimental bookmaking process in residency upstate Michigan, and really got into the design process, and on the suggestion of some of the instructors there, I started looking into typography. As one does when you're doing that, one of the first things I came across was the Helvetica documentary. Mm-hmm. And in that documentary, Tobias Fair-Jones had this to say. So he's talking about, why a typeface like Helvetica can look so different in all these different treatments. So the sort of classical modernist line of how aware a reader should be of a typeface is that they shouldn't be aware of it at all. It should be this crystal goblet there to just hold and display and organize the information. But I don't really think it's quite as simple as that. I think that even if they're not consciously aware of the typeface that they're reading, they'll certainly be affected by it, the same way that an actor that's miscast in a role affects someone's experience of a movie or a play that they're watching. They'll still follow the plot, but they'll be less convinced or affected. I think that typography is similar to that. A designer choosing a typeface is essentially a casting director. So that was really kind of like an aha moment. I started thinking about that and thinking back to when models were described in that way, right? Because at the same time that we had all these model controversies and casting and modeling agents were being pitted as the bad guys, there was also this sense of certain kinds of xenophobic and racialized languages about models aren't models anymore, there's no development, there's no investment, it needs to be American, it needs to be this and that. And so Anna Wintour and her letter to the editor where she's trying to promote the ideas of models being on covers again, she has this to say: so when a model wears clothes, one is free to engage imaginatively with the looks and the narratives they suggest. When an actress wears clothes, the pleasure very often lies in thinking about her. So I was interested in this idea of this vessel that still conveys something, but that allows all of these different kinds of projections to be put on it. So faces and fonts are also something that we're both intimately familiar with on a day-to-day basis. We read things that have been designed by people. We see images that have been carefully thought out by people, even if we don't really see the traces of those production. It's something that forms kind of the visual texture in the landscape, especially in the commercial landscape. So in thinking about the similarities between these two things, I started making a running list, right? So models and typefaces are both things that can be in development. They're things that can be released and promoted. They're thought of as instruments. They can appear to be natural or transparent, even though there's a ton of labor that goes into them, right? Part of what makes something successful, right, is if you're not noticing all the work that goes into it. So there's that sense in both of these. They function as mediums for other messages. They're both things that have a face, and they're both things that have a mood. So in this list, there was this kind of blurring that was happening for me in terms of an object and a person, right? So subject, object, human, non-human, that I kind of referenced in terms of things having a face and a body, but also the sense that models are, objectified, and that's a bad thing, that they're dehumanized, and that's a bad thing. So to try to think through this, I was thinking a lot about John Hartigan's work, who's an anthropologist that's written about race in the United States, and then got interested in the Mexican Genome Project. And as part of that work, he was doing field work there and trying to see if the US concept of race maps onto the Mexican concept of raza, right? And what he found is, with the genome, they were doing the Mexican genome, which had all these ideas about mestizaje, but they were also doing it for plants. And through this language of alien plants and invasive plants and how that was being mapped back onto racial difference, he found out that the concept of la raza actually originated in plants, not people, in the Mexican context. And so he was saying, all of these things that we think about as personification or anthropomorphism, we take a few steps back to see not just how it's going from human to non-human, but going back and forth, it can be a productive way to decenter the human and to decenter, what it is we think is happening in terms of objectification. Tim Ingold and Elizabeth Hollums from Making to Growing also became really helpful for me to think through this. And so that's the movement from an artifact to an organism, right? And so we already have some of this in terms of objects having social lives. We can think about their circuits and how they develop and grow. But this sense of making, right, is very much of an outsider perspective that doesn't take into account how people that are actually engaged in the making of things think about their work, right? So they give the example of, when you ask somebody what they're making, they'll give you the answer of the end object, right? But that's not necessarily how they experience it, right? And so thinking about these fonts as not fixed objects, which is more and more the case now with digital releases. Like, they can push updates, they'll do script extensions, they'll do create families and super families, and so these aren't end products necessarily. They're functional, they're usable, but they continue to grow, they continue to develop. In the same way that models, if we think about these cards, Hane's cards over a 10-year period, she's still the same person, but it's this becoming, right? And so how do we think about these things and their relationships? How do we think about them if we're not looking at them as fixed objects, right? If they're not functioning in that way, but if we're thinking about them in process, if we're thinking about not just how they're used and how they circulate and what happens to them when they go to the trash, but how the people that are making them think about them, right? So if they're not saving them, maybe it's not a bad thing. Maybe I shouldn't be trying to fish them out of the trash can and digitize them, right? Which is still my impulse, sadly. Yeah, and how would this change what it is that we're looking at? So then this leads to the question of material forms and functions. On an ethnographic level, how are people thinking about this? So Nick Sherman's a typeface designer. He's also a specimen designer that's written a lot about this, and he thinks a lot about it. He thinks that specimen design is an art form. He thinks it should be studied. He's very much about that. But he readily admits the design is not what they're looking at. They're looking at the thing being presented, right? So on the one hand, this is like a very unique object that allows us to see and focus on the thing itself, the model, right? Not in the service of something else, but just as a model, just as a typeface. But there's still people that are producing these, right? And they're thoughtful about it, and they're playful about it, and the ways in which we think these things are working, they're effacing some of that labor by making it transparent. And so the specimen, also finding the specimen designers has been kind of a little pickle because they're not credited on these specimens, right? So it's kind of like doing this, undercover work of finding their names listed on a website, talking to them, and then discovering that they've done all this other work. And a lot of them say, why would my name be on the specimen? It's not my work, right? And so what is this thing, right? So it's obviously media about media. That I still feel pretty confident about, that that's what's happening here. But what's the genre, right? Are they documents? Are they instructional? Are they inspirational? you know, what is the point of them? They're ephemera, right? But what's going on? And so going back to that idea of moving from making to growing, you know, what if instead of promotion, which they are, we think of them as a prototype, right? Something that's being created, something that's is the process of trial and error. You know, even with that algorithm that David showed me, you know, it would pull up all of these different words, and he has a way of sorting through them, right? He has a way of like making jokes about it. He has a way of when it feels right. So thinking about these documents and thinking about this ephemera as maybe unclosed objects, as things that have a life even beyond their circulation. I think that these items are also really interesting because it's not judging it against like what actually becomes popular, right? It's what was plausible at the time, you know? And so it gives us some kind of sense about the current moment and how people are thinking about the possibility of not just that medium, but also the typeface as a medium itself, the model as a medium itself. So it's giving us a lot of important information. And so when we focus on process, we see different creative ways that these seemingly straightforward documents are being produced. When I was in the field in the fashion industry, agents would talk about needing to be in the right mood before they would put a model's portfolio together or pick cards. And so there's all these other atmospheric qualities that are part of it. And talking to printers that worked on these show packages, they would talk about the different back and forth. And so how can we capture some of that and connect it to these documents that like not only opens up a critical space for these to be taken more seriously and this work to be taken more seriously, but also to see what it could reveal. One of the other things that has come through focusing on these forms in particular is the idea that even though they're contributing to this idea of broader types, it's still the goal for all of these things is to arrange a face-to-face meeting, right? So in the case of the models, it's about getting the foot in the door so that they can actually meet with a client, and then that's where it's happening, right? So it's requiring a face-to-face, it's requiring a certain kind of engagement. With the typefaces, a lot of the specimen designers that I've talked to have said that they feel a little bit more empathy for people that pirate fonts, because in doing the work and working with a specimen, they have to play around a lot with a typeface before they know what it can do. And so their job, as they see it, is to really communicate through the specimen all the different things that you could imaginatively do with it and to instruct in that way. And so I think that that idea of engagement and relationality that's happening through these media forms is something significant and something that we should think about as this kind of human, non-human division. So the designers of these are not seeing them as documents unto themselves, and they're not seeing them as things that necessarily need to be judged by how the end user makes use of them. Yeah. So now the digital archive, now where I'm going to kind of go against everything I've said because I came up with some of this before, but I'm trying to be flexible and thinking about what I should be doing with it. So this is the website for the model archives of the Marlowe Press. And you can see here he's got model composites, he's got agency books, he's got these head sheets that used to be really popular. And then the interface that he has is you can search for models by name. This is really popular for people to find, like, famous models. And he has a disclaimer that if you're one of the models that's in this archive and you want your name attached or you want your image removed, contact him, right? And then this is the information that comes up. That's that bottom right-hand side. So you have an image, the agency, the year, and then a link to the book. So this is something he's started in the past year. He also has a lot of his own press clippings. He's kind of an interesting guy. And he's really trying to claim the authority that he's the one who invented these things, right? The other website where I've been populating my prototype of a database is models.com. And models.com started in 2002, 2003, and was originally just kind of reporting on the backstage of fashion. But what they have been able to do by posting some of those crazy show packages at the beginning is now all of the agencies from all over the world send them theirs, and they document it. You're going to see in the next slide that they, and I've talked to them, they are not really in the business of keeping an archive, right? And so they said, this stuff is up there because of the nature of web publishing, it's not that interesting to us. They have other kinds of databases where you can search, like you can search Hani and see all of her current agencies, you can see her recent stuff. And so they're marketed towards a really different kind of audience. But supplementing the packages that I collected when I was in the field, they have a pretty good number of these. And they luckily do a really good job of naming the files with the model's actual name, so that when I make this database, I'm able to pull those images, make it into a PDF, put it in a container in FileMaker Pro, and then copy the file names to have a search functionality. But right now, what I'm using this for is just to gather all of this visual material. There's about 447, 448 records right now. And to think about what are the qualities of this, how can I record that? Like, where is the branding happening? Where does social media come in? Are there photo credits? Are there production credits? What do these things look like? If there's an online video component, including a container for that. If there's material collateral, including a container for that. So thinking through this process and working with this package designer that's responsible for this amazing coloring book, which I encourage everybody to look up, where he's like digitally erased their clothing and then redrawn it, he has all of this stuff. So much like Peter Marlowe, he was a printer, he was a print producer, and so he has an archive of this stuff that's just in his attic, right? And I feel like I should document it, right? Like, I feel like this should be somewhere, because none of these show packages exist in any institutional repository. The ones that are kept at the agencies are incomplete. And so, I'm sorry, all these slides are so small, but on the left, this is a census of all the stuff that I've been able to get off models.com. So you can see, like, there's years where, like, nothing has been saved on the website. So my process right now is to pick about 12 of these agencies to see what they have at the agency, work with a packaging designer to document them. So, like, this one on the top, it's this beautiful, like, velvet box. There were 300 produced. It cost $80,000, and maybe 3 still exist, right? Or this one, it's like a fake book, but it's like a beautifully beveled inside so that the cards lay flat. Because what you get in models.com are just flat images. There's no dimension information, there's no sense of it. And even though I had seen this video of this beautiful coloring book, holding it in my hand was a whole other story. So that's some of what I'm thinking about in terms of other places that this project can go. I'm also doing this with the typeface specimens, but it's a little bit more straightforward, except for the whole New York problem that I'm having, because the typeface designers are really good at doing their own documentation and keeping that pretty updated. And one of the interesting things that I've found through this is that this also becomes a research tool when working with agents and designers, because I do an interview, 2 hours, talk about it, look at all their packages, and then I'm showing, like, oh, hey, like, do you want to look at this? And they love it, because they're looking through it, like, oh, I did that one. Oh, that one's terrible, you know. I remember this one, you know, have you seen this one? What's going on with this person? And so thinking, too, about not just, like, what I can give back to the industry, right? Because this is in some ways a transactional relationship. To get access to these, I'm helping this guy document his stuff for free. And I also think that it's of value, and I want to, you know, write critically about it so that they can get more attention. So there's some interesting complications of not just kind of doing a straightforward research project, so thinking about what's owed to the people that I'm working with. So in summary, faces and fonts are both something that we confront and use and relate to daily, but there are things that come from somewhere. The question of face is an important one to me, as is the question of how the faces we see and use affect our perception of the world. It's about a feeling, it's about a mood. We need to look at the individuals in charge of producing and promoting these types And by focusing on these in-industry uses, I think that we can have a different kind of understanding about what's actually going on here, about how capitalism actually works, about how commercial imagery actually works, that really has a dramatic effect on the broader commercial landscape. I think it's important for us to remember that typification exceeds intention, right? It's not something that we can necessarily control, but it depends on certain kinds of interactions and engagements that accrete, build up over time, and calcify and shape our perception. But they're things that can be reversed or remolded. So by paying attention to how abstract affects and relationships are materialized in these most mundane but sometimes spectacular forms, we can begin to trouble how categories and our ideas about them come into form. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful talk that's asked these huge questions.
Yeah.
That looked at very sort of granular questions of this ephemeral type. We're actually at the hour, but we have a time for a few questions. So I open the floor.
And you may object to this because it's not quite in your wheelhouse, I guess. But one thing I think is very interesting, this idea of communicative power of the typeface, communicative power of the visual face. That's an interesting juxtaposition. But one thing that just kind of jumped out at me is some of the terminology that I was also kind of curious about. And that appeared at the very end in one of those archival websites that were collecting information. And Hannah, her bio came up, and it kind of traced all of these things, and there were terminology like industry icon and mother agency.
Yeah.
And I just thought, well, where do those come? How accepted are they? And you know, it's an interesting idea that the typefaces communicate something even when it's a nonsense word. But I was also very curious about some of that meaning that has developed the terminology and the secret language of this world, in this design world. And I don't know whether there are parallels in the typeface world, whether people trace the genetics, so to speak, of the fonts.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of historical research and references to certain lineages of fonts and how they reinterpret or revive them. To speak to your question about like industry icon, that's more of a models.com branding thing. They make these lists of top 50 models, model of the year, industry icons, blue chip models. So that's kind of...
Does that kind of seem like it's working its way through the... No, it's just...
No, I mean, everybody looks at models.com, but it's not part of the broader language. Like, they want to make sure that their models are on those lists. But mother agency, that's why they're used, definitely. And some of these like family relational terms keep popping up that are really interesting to me, but I'm trying to make sense of what to do with those as well. But yeah, your point's well taken. Thank you.
I think for anyone who is remotely a cultural historian, the impulse to want to document is inborn in everyone, and so I absolutely applaud that. But I would be really lying if I didn't say that I have a lot of trouble looking at it. Just like feminist in me has a lot of trouble with this, the whole concept. And I'm wondering where the critique is in this. That is, to what extent is it kind of celebratory of an industry that has caused a lot of damage? And to what extent is it a critique, an understanding of the history of that damage, how it's evolved and changed, and what the problems are with it?
Sure.
And I'm just wondering where that fits.
Absolutely. I'm definitely starting from a point where, is the fashion industry misogynist and racist? Yes. Are the people that are working in it that? Yes and no. I think that drawing on people like Laura Nader studying up, I think it's important to study power. I think it's important to study what are the cultural logics that are producing this. And beyond that, I think that there's a lot of critical scholarship that already exists that does that feminist work and does that critique. What I'm trying to do is understand what are the categories of that undergird that. So how does the category of a model even come into being? What does the category of a human look like? So I definitely see my work in conversation with that, and service to that, but it's oriented towards a different lens, because in order to get access to these spaces, not that I hid my politics at all, but like having a determined endpoint at the outset would be a non-starter. And so for me, it was really trying to understand who these people are, how are they thinking about the work that they do, and also, you know, with the first book manuscript, broadening it beyond just the fashion images that they produce. So a lot of these casting directors are also making documentary films, they're making art, and, you know, I think that we have to, you know, see them in the full breadth of the work that they do. And a lot of them, it's like a daily struggle in terms of what it is that they see that they're able to change in the industry that's incremental. And we see this a lot with racial diversity. And a lot of the casting directors that I've worked with and the modeling agents that I've worked with are committed to doing that kind of work. So yeah, I take your point, but I'm trying to ask different questions. I think that it still is possible to be critical, but it's a different kind of analysis.
Yeah.
It's interesting this disposable nature of the product that you're talking about, and how that also correlates to the kind of ephemeral nature of the model as well, that they are discarded and they're being judged and evaluated and essentially tossed away when they have used up their value to these agencies. And I'm wondering if, like, following certain models, you've seen like how which ones are being disposed of, or which ones are being not finding additional work after, and if there's threads that might be worth exploring there, because it's just this kind of there is that relationship between this package you're talking about, that just serve this purpose in very short-lived moment.
Yeah, and I think it's tied to industry trends. So when this critique happened about like there aren't real models anymore, there's not investment in development, you definitely saw that, and that can be linked to things like Tom Ford leaving design and Prada becoming the top one, and James Scully, who was doing not James Scully, I'm so sorry, I can't remember his name, but the guy who was in charge of casting that, wanting to find newer exclusive models in Eastern Europe, which had just opened, and then that whole idea of the Prada exclusive. So you can trace these kinds of industry trends. They might be visible in these packages when, you know, certain models fall out. Yeah, I would have to think more about that, because I'm also kind of pitching this more towards the top elite agencies, because they're the ones that have the resources to make these kind of extravagant packages and also have archives. But there's also agencies that kind of like disappear in those models. And working with casting directors that do real people, a lot of those models from B-level agencies show up in those casting files. So there's a lot going on.
Sorry? Yes, I think this has to be the last one, because I know people have to go to class and so on, but we can, after this we can continue I have to go to class, actually. But we can continue informally, but please, yeah.
How do you deal with the topic of objectification? Because it seems to me that by all means the fashion industry objectifies the models and their body, but it also that when you associate the idea of the model and the idea of the type in a way that also reinforces that idea of objectification. So how do you reconcile that?
Because I'm also trying to see how the typefaces have to have a personality and have to have a face and a body, and how they have to be animating. And so maybe there's something about a fluidity between subjectification and objectification, right? Like any of our ideas and our thoughts, we have to objectify them into language. So there might be a more general process going on. And if the knee-jerk is to say, like, to become an object is bad, to become a subject is good, we see this with commercial brand identities, right? Like, or we see this with corporations becoming more people-like. So it's really about tracing that balance between when the pendulum swings and what's being produced. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. We went into a trance and talked for an hour.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.